Sports shape lives, build communities, and drive billion-dollar industries. Yet their true impact often goes unnoticed.
From personal growth and well being to career potential, it's time to rethink what sports can do. This is the Why Not Sports podcast. Welcome to the Why Not Sports podcast, a podcast where we dive into the business and community side of sports industry. Today, we are honored to welcome Eric Moyen.
Eric Moyen is a historian, author, and professor specializing in the intersection of higher education and athletics. He co-authored College Sports: A History, which traces the evolution of intercollegiate athletics from the 19th century to present. In addition to his administrative role, Moyen teaches courses such as History of American Higher Education and Research in Higher Education, where he explores origins, trends, and broader social, cultural, and economic context of U.S. higher education. His experience provides a deep understanding of how sports shape the educational landscape.
Eric, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. And Aaron, kind of the question we like to start off with is, what's your sports story?
I grew up loving sports. My dad kind of inculcated that in myself and my three other siblings. I was a basketball player. I played some soccer as well and played on the golf team because it was free golf, but I was never really a good golfer. So I had a growth spurt early on in life, and I was the same height I am today when I was in seventh, eighth grade, when I was in middle school. So which is 6 feet tall. So I thought I was destined to be in the NBA. But then I quit growing, and my high school, I had a ball playing basketball, but I thought, well, I'm going to play college ball, but I'm only going to play if I can play at a D1 school. And I had absolutely zero D1 offers. And I had one walk-on offer. I don't know if you are familiar with Furman University in South Carolina. It's a great little school. And their coach said to me, "Oh, I would love to have you as a walk-on on our team. Here's the guarantee. If you show up every day and give me everything you've got as if your life depended on it, I promise you, you will not see the floor, a basketball court, until your junior year." And I thought, okay, well, he's being honest with me. I think I'll skip this and enjoy college. So, but I do love sports and always have: football, baseball, basketball, all of it. So, yeah, that's a little bit about my sports story.
Absolutely. And I guess growing up in Kentucky and in Lexington, particularly, like a city obviously tied to a big college program, how did that shape your perspective on the role of athletics in universities from an early age, or I guess now until
So
today?
I grew up right next to UK's campus. In fact, the neighborhood where I lived was backed up to what was an experiment farm. UK is Kentucky's land grant, just like Texas A&M. And so ag and engineering are both big things. And so there was a farm back there. It's now an arboretum, but the football stadium was built there. They got rid of their original stadium and built it on this farm. And so growing up, I would sell lemonade for 10 cents a cup to fans who parked all around the neighborhood, going to games, and I'd make $3 or $4. And then, in Kentucky, late October and November, I'd switch to hot chocolate. And UK was not exceptional in a good way in football when I was growing up. So after I would do that, I'd get with my buddies and the K Club, people who took actual real tickets at the time. They just let us go in and we'd watch the game. So I grew up right next to campus, loving even football when it wasn't very good, as well as basketball.
That's awesome. That's awesome. And I guess our big thing with you, Eric, such a professional and like in the sports environment, especially with academia, for you, how would you answer the question, why not sports?
I would say that sports, anything in life that involves humans, has some really negative stuff involved with it. There are scandals, there's cheating, there are all kinds of problems in anything in life. But at its best, athletics provides, it is in so many ways a microcosm what a good life is, right? Trusting other people, working hard, knowing when to take the lead and when to pass, helping others when they mess up, forgiving yourself or letting other people help you. Valuable life lessons that sports offers, I think, is incredible. And that's not to take away from it's not a utopia, and there are all kinds of challenges. but I think that there are so many life lessons in sports. If you were to go through my algorithms on social media, it's Kobe Bryant and John Wooden and Nick Saban, and very rarely is it about X's and O's. They're talking about leadership and life and how what they do relates to that. And so I think that's a great answer as to why not sport.
Absolutely. And do you kind of have a core or favorite saying, favorite philosophy from somebody like Nick Saban, like Kobe Bryant, that comes to the top of your head that you might be like deem as your favorite?
So I'll butcher the quote. I don't have it printed out in front of me, but there's a quote by Kirby Smart, and it was in a post-game press conference where he was talking about the cost of leadership. And in the quote, he said, people talk about leadership and their interest in leadership. He says, here's what I know about leaders. I'm trying to find this fast enough so I don't butcher it. I did. So Kirby Smart, he said, here's what leadership will cost you. One, you have to make hard decisions that will negatively impact people you care about. Two, you will be disliked despite your best attempts to do the best for the most people. And three, you will be misunderstood and you won't have the opportunity to defend yourself. And that sounds kind of like a downer, right? These are the challenges, but
Leadership hurts. Yeah.
yeah, the upside of that, if you can understand that you don't have to be everybody's favorite, but in the long run, if you're honest and you work hard and you're working hard for other people, there's a cost to leadership. But then there is this thing where you get to see the fruit of your labor, your efforts, and how it helps other people and how it changes people's lives. And I think that that's really, really important. For me, I didn't really know what I wanted to do when I grew up, besides playing the NBA, which wasn't going to happen. And I spent my first semester on a college campus. I went to a little Christian liberal arts college in northern Indiana called Taylor University. Their only sports claim to fame, if you've ever seen it, it comes around about once a year. They do a thing called Silent Night, where all the students come dressed up in costumes and stuff, and they're completely silent until Taylor scores their 10th point and then act like they've won the World Cup and get a technical foul and keep going. But after my first semester at Taylor, I came home over the break and I told my parents, I want to spend the rest of my life on a college campus. And looking back on that, it was because I had professors and other staff members at Taylor who were willing to pour into me, and it changed my life. And so hopefully I get to do that for others as well and talk about cool stuff like this. So that cost of leadership, there's the flip side to it as well, but that's a great introduction into some of the challenges as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So kind of on the subject of your kind of academical history, could you delve a little deeper into kind of your journey through your 3 universities that you attended and kind of how that led you to a career in academia and as well as authoring?
Sure. So as I mentioned, after my first semester, I knew I wanted to spend my life on a college campus, and I was trying to figure out what to do. Do I want to do history or do I want to do education? And I wasn't really sure. After I graduated, and I was a social studies education major, so I thought I would probably end up teaching high school and coaching for a few years. But I went right into a master's program in history at the University of Alabama, where I got to study under a brilliant professor. He's now deceased. His name was Forrest McDonald. He was a Pulitzer Prize finalist on constitutional history, and he really changed my life as well. So I had this interest in history and an interest in education. And near the end of my program, my master's program, he said, hey, go teach high school for a couple of years, but you can do both of these things. There's a way for you to study history and education. Look into it. I don't know a whole lot about it. And that general field in education is called foundations of ed. If you study history, philosophy, sociology of ed. And I did what he asked, and I realized, oh my gosh, I can get a PhD in higher ed, and I can study the history of higher ed. And it's both things that I love, and I can end up on a college campus. And so I was looking where I wanted to go to grad school, and I lucked out. John Thielen, who is kind of the authority in the US on history of higher ed, was at UK. And so I didn't have to move. After I finished my degree at Alabama, I moved back to Lexington and taught high school for 3 years. And so I went back into this PhD program, and he had written a book in the late 80s called Games Colleges Play, Scandal and Reform in College Athletics. It's a really, really good book, but he also wrote kind of the history of American higher education. So getting to study under him, with him, serving as a research assistant was wonderful. And I took his class, Higher Ed and Athletics, and I loved it. I was worried. I would have loved to have studied higher ed and athletics as my dissertation topic, but I was worried about the job market and if people would think, oh, this isn't really, education stuff. So I wrote on town gown relations and how colleges and universities deal with their host communities, which tied in with athletics some as well as education. And then I ended up taking a job at Lee University, which is in Tennessee, and they're athletically their NCAA Division II school. Spent 13 years there. And while I was there, I wrote a book. Longtime president at the University of Kentucky, his name was Frank McVeigh. I knew very little about him, but the president at the time, his name was Lee Todd, wanted a book written about Frank McVeigh, and I agreed to do that. So a couple hundred archival boxes in UK's special collections, and a bunch of them were on athletics. And that's when I began to realize, wow, presidents are really, really involved. University presidents, especially across the board, but especially at big time programs, are very involved. And a lot of people seem to think, oh, this is, athletics is kind of this secondary thing. And I started to realize, no, it's not. It's a big part of this. So I really got interested in his role as the first president of the Southeastern Conference, moved into an assistant VP role at Lee and had to set writing down. I thought, there's more to be done here. So I took a job at Mississippi State as their department head of ed leadership and started writing a book with a guy who is still alive. His name's Jim Host, and he's a pioneer in sports business. He and Clyde Lear are the two big names in terms of college sports marketing and what they did in the 80s and 90s. He was looking for someone to help him write his memoir, and someone reached out to me about that. And I thought, this is what I need, because right now my perspective is all on the inside and the academic approach looking out. And this is going to be really great in terms of actually understanding what's going on in the outside business world looking in. And so finished that book with him, and then thought, okay, I've got the background now where I can work with my mentor, and we can write what we believe to be the first kind of survey of all of college athletics, from the very beginning, in rowing and Olympic sports. And football, of course, is really, really important in that, because that's the revenue driving machine, but looking at all of that different stuff. So that's a little bit, maybe more than you wanted on the journey to get to where.
That's perfect, Eric. That's great context. And how do you feel like that your historical perspective, is helping like the landscape like move forward? Kind of what's your take on like, understanding history, especially in the context of sports and college athletics, right?
I don't know if you all liked your history in high school or in college, or a lot of kids, just a lot of adults as well, think, oh, history's names, dates, and if you get into understanding history in this fancy term, historiography, which is the history of histories, or the argument that historians are making on whatever issue it is, about whatever war, about whatever president, if this is, right, there are judgments made about, is this a good or a bad era? Are these good or bad policies? And how do these arguments change over time? And so having earned a graduate degree in history, I think really helped me looking at what had been written about history, which was history of athletics, which is, you had on one side commercial books which were written for fans, and they were all about, the glories of Notre Dame and the Four Horsemen and how wonderful it was. Or you had a limited number of academics writing about terrible and out of control athletics was or is, and finding this where you can say, yeah, some of that's true about both of these things, and how does it work together? And in terms of historiography, or things that will help people, whether they're working in higher ed, the business side of college sports, is things like reform. The word reform has been used for more than the last century about college athletics, but it's really misused, because reform is a term that's designed to take what exists and make it better. And the NCAA did reform some things early on when they first started, like 1906, 1907, those first years, where they made the game safer, because college and high school kids were dying. And so they implemented different, the forward pass, or the line of scrimmage, or these things that people go, why do we call this football? And why do we call soccer soccer? A lot of it stems from these kinds of reforms. So people kept using that term, but they weren't looking forward. They were looking backward, trying to turn it into something that it never really was, right? Where they thought that athletics was all just about kind of a natural guys in the dorm go out and have an intramural game. And that's really not the way things were. And the same is true of how people defined amateurism, which is really a myth. There's a historian of college sports. His name's Ronald Smith, who's written a book on that. That's fantastic. And then the other piece, the last part of the history piece of this that I think is really important and what we argue in our book, which hasn't been argued before, is that typically higher ed and athletics are viewed as these two anomalies that don't fit together. And what we argue is that no, actually the modern university, with its focus on specialization, with its focus on professionalism, with its focus on what we call academic freedom, but freedom within your department to do things the way you see fit and not be told by others, that the way the modern university developed in America was fertile ground for athletics to turn into what it is. What you don't see are small liberal arts colleges with big time athletic programs. And it's not just because of the size of the fan base, it's the difference in mission and what they emphasize. So those are some of the kind of cool things that history played into this story.
Yeah, so kind of digging deeper on it, what are some of the defining moments that you kind of have identified and believe really changed the perception of college athletics from kind of more of a intramural, casual outing into the behemoth it is today?
Right.
Yeah.
One that is more trivial than anything else, but is worth mentioning is when Harvard played McGill in football. Intercollegiate athletics started in the 1850s. There was a crew race between Harvard and Yale. Then football in the 1860s, and football looked a lot more like what we would call soccer. But McGill in Canada had a rugby style football game, and no one in the US wanted to play it. But Harvard agreed to, let's play one game our way and one game your way. And they liked McGill's rugby style football more. And so when people say, well, why is football football? How did this happen? It really was when McGill and Harvard played that allowed this evolution of what we call American football to happen. I think a big piece of this, and it's an unintended consequence, is intercollegiate athletics was a student-run activity. Students owned it. They organized it. They sent letters to each other. They played. And by the late 1800s, faculty members were saying, this has gotten out of control. We need to do something about this. Faculty need oversight over athletics. And in this really odd way, as regional athletic associations start to develop, like the Western Conference, which becomes the Big Ten, or the Southern Conference, or the Southwest Conference, or the Ivy League doesn't form until later, but they have multiple meetings, is that what happens is faculty members think we're going to have oversight over this to minimize its impact. And what happens is it actually helps the sport grow, because now all of a sudden you have organization of conference tournaments, and it's easy to keep up with records, and the schedules are set the year before, and we know what's going to happen. So there's this unintended consequence of popularity with that faculty were not expecting. They're saying, how do we get control of this, all the way into the 1920s and early 30s, when there's a Carnegie report on college athletics and all of its abuses, and how in the world are we going to stop this? And they basically say, hey, faculty haven't been able to control college athletics. What we need are presidents. If presidents get in control of this, then we'll be able to minimize it. And I don't know how much of the book you've read, but that's where Frank McVeigh jumps in, the president at UK, who he is not an athletics fan, and he really wants to see a de-emphasis in college sports. And so he takes the presidency of the Southeastern Conference, which forms in the early 30s. That's a fascinating story in and of itself. But and he does this in order to take out the commercial aspects of college athletics and place it back within the curriculum of the school. So you all may have heard me say before in other interviews, I love to call the Southeastern Conference the most successful failure ever, because it failed in its initial mission. But that's largely because you had booster presidents like George, he went by Mike Denny at Alabama. So Bryant Denny Stadium and Sanford Stadium in Georgia, that's their
Yeah.
president. And Jordan Hare Stadium at Auburn, that's Hare is Auburn's president. You had presidents who wanted to use athletics as a way to promote their university. And those who did that really developed these power programs. And then, of course, my alma mater, Kentucky, has lagged in football. I think because Frank McVay thought that football was extremely problematic. He didn't care much about basketball, and this coach Adolph Rupp and what he's doing. And so I think that's some of UK's story.
So then kind of tying back to Frank McVay, you kind of talked about his attitudes being generally against college athletics. But do you think that there was any positive benefits from his sentiments?
Sure. There were abuses that were out of control. And in the 1920s and 30s, he was president of UK in the teens, 20s, 30s, and 40s. The abuses were just rampant, what was known as the little black box. It was typically the athletic director was the football coach who had a desk, and in the desk was a box, and how much do you need to play for me, right? And so they're paying athletes. Every school said no recruiting, no subsidizing. Teams should come naturally from the student body. And every school was recruiting, and every school was subsidizing. And they weren't allowed to have training tables as like special meals for athletes, and schools were doing that. So the dishonesty of that, as opposed to saying, hey, this is what's going on, let's figure out how to regulate it. And after Frank McVay finished his few years as president of the SEC, the next president, his name was John Tigert. He was president at Florida. And he said, we're all lying. Let's be honest, and let's be the first conference to say we are going to consider athletic talent when we offer scholarships. That's going to be part of the deal. And the other conferences around the country, most notably the Big Ten, really, really freaked out about it. So did the Southern Conference, which morphs into the ACC. The closest one, so Texas A&M would have been in the Southwest Conference. They were quick to buy into that argument as well. So, and I think a lot of that had to do with because the schools in the South at the time were substantially poorer than the schools in the Northeast and Midwest, when Ivy League schools were still powerhouses. And so they didn't need to offer scholarships because they had plenty of jobs on campus for students to take, or phantom jobs that didn't have much, or families could say, yeah, I want to, an alum could say, I want to pay this kid's tuition. Which was just commonplace. So yes, back to your original question about what Frank McVay was doing that was right was trying to identify all of this dishonesty that was going on in athletics and try and right that ship. So yes, he had a lot of justification for his.
Yeah, and obviously over the past few years, we've kind of made there's been a lot of changes. There's been a lot of strides in that department, right? Like kind of like having a little more equity across like the NIL landscape and different opportunities for athletes. But I mean, consuming a lot of college sports media, there's a lot of it often gets labeled as the Wild West still, right? Like navigating this new NIL landscape. And like Eric, I'm really curious from your historical perspective, like I guess if you had to predict how this is going to play out, or how you can kind of rein some of the some of the cowboys in this Wild West, yes, how would you do that, right? Like how, or I guess those are two different questions. One, like, what do you think is going to happen? And two, if you were in charge of it, like, what would you do?
So what I think is going to happen is that whether it's one or two power conferences, which we've kind of established with the Big Ten and the SEC, or whether it's four, it would make a lot of sense to have four regional big conferences. There's going to be somewhere between 40 and 80 teams that are going to end up in this big time for profit that we share with players. That difference between 40 and 80 is going to be a huge deal of who gets in and who gets left out. So if you have 80, there are some other options. But if you're in the 40 or 50 range in Texas, it's going to be UT Austin and Texas A&M. That's it. It's not going to be a Houston, a Texas Tech, a Baylor, that are going to get to participate in that. Exactly how that's going to play out, I don't know, but I do know that the SEC and the Big Ten are in the driver's seat, and that's largely because the NCAA coming into NIL just abdicated any role in this. And that goes back to some of the historiography that I was talking about that I wish the NCAA and some of the conferences would have said, let's, going back to Frank McVeigh or John Tiger, let's be honest about this. There's so much money being made now because of people like Jim Host, who figured out a way to monetize college athletics that it's a fair thing to share with players. And if we think about how does this help the university and not stop there, ask how does this help the university and how can it help student athletes, people who really are students and athletes. Like a lot of professors kind of roll their eyes at that, right? Oh, student athletes, sure. Well, there are plenty of examples that could make people very, very cynical, plenty of examples of universities who basically exploited athletes, just shameful stuff. But there are also thousands and thousands of people all across the country, hundreds of thousands, I would say, who were student athletes, and they were good students, and they're doing wonderful things, and they loved their college and their athletic experience. So if we'd say, let's be honest about this and try and help the universities and the students and figure out a way to help kids stay in school, right? Rather than just saying, this is amateurism and there's no place for paying athletes at all. I have a daughter who is in Nashville and she goes to Belmont University and she wants to be a singer-songwriter. Guess what? She can go to any club, bar, play music, make money, and she doesn't lose her scholarship. It's not like she's tainted and no longer a good musician because she's made some money off of this. So if there were ways where we could say, let's be realistic about this, but we've really missed those opportunities. So it makes the reform that needs to happen that much more difficult, because rather than saying, okay, let's do this from the beginning, all the way back to Johnny Manziel playing at Texas A&M, and he's on the cover of Time magazine, and Time saying it's time to pay the players. There's basically a decade in there where the NCAA did nothing with that. So that's where some of the problem is, and I hope that the solutions aren't just money. Obviously, money is a consideration, but that the presidents, the ADs sitting around the table working with media companies are saying, okay, we're going to make money off this, but what's best for students in this, and how can we help students? That needs to be part of the equation.
Yeah, and I think you brought up one of the key advantages earlier is kind of with NIL, a lot of students are encouraged to stay in college longer now that they can receive payment now. And, in the NFL, in basketball, that could lead to them being here, 3-4 more years. For football, it's, 2-3 more years. So definitely one of the hidden benefits there. What are kind of some of the kind of downsides that you've been seeing kind of with increased responsibility in the form of NIL, kind of obligations, I guess, kind of higher standards of play, kind of in terms of dedication towards practice, but also in terms of outside opportunities that they need to do in order to kind of like earn the NIL per se, with media availability and whatnot?
Sure. So again, it kind of goes back to some regulation where we could say, we being whatever association, whether that's the NCAA or an agreement among conferences or whatever it is, that sure, right, NIL, people should get paid for their name, image. Like what we have going on right now is not purely NIL. It is pay for play. You come here and you sign this contract and we're going to make you do X, Y, and Z. You could say, hey, you play football. Your season is primarily the fall. Here are the 2 months during the spring where you can actually sign NIL deals where you sell Ford trucks or you sell Coca-Cola or whatever it might be, and you get paid for that. And as a university, we want to help you. So we're going to provide you some sort of legal assistance or accounting for taxes. And what does this mean? Another thing that I think you could do is say, you may be able to start earning money as a freshman, but this money won't stay with you until you're a sophomore with reasonable grades who hasn't transferred. I absolutely think kids should be able to transfer where they want to go, but I'm not always sure it's in the best interest of athletes who have people in their ear,
Hmm.
telling them things when sometimes it's really good in life, getting back these life lessons to wait. You may not get as much playing time as you need. You may not, whatever, but hang on, persevere. There are ways where you can think about those things because I'm not convinced that it's a great college experience for a player in whatever sport to go to 4 different schools in 4 years. I don't see how you build that kind of community and work efficiently toward a degree doing those things, if that makes sense.
Yeah, for sure. And then if you could kind of give some historical context to that, kind of just thinking back to the early days of collegiate athletics, when do you think it kind of became more prominent to transfer purely for, athletic purposes and kind of when that became kind of more rampant?
Sure. So in the 1800s, players often transferred, and then they had players that were called ringers. And ringers were players who would show up and be playing for the University of Pennsylvania. And then the next week, they're playing for Cornell, and they aren't even really part of the student body, right? This is one of the reasons faculty members got involved. And it, so this idea of kids moving around has been around a long time. And I don't know if you all remember, but until the 70s, first year students didn't play varsity sports. They could play a couple JV games, but the idea was you need to get acclimated to university life and studying. You can practice with the team, but interestingly enough, it goes back to wanting to win games. The schools that really fought the freshman rule, as it was called, were small schools who didn't have nearly as many students, and they wanted to be able to play their freshmen against these bigger schools. So all the way back, schools were, offering to give money to students or saying you didn't have to take the entrance exam. And I'm talking to Ivy League schools too, right? This is how you get in. We really want you to transfer here. And players writing letters to their family. Well, I didn't really get a good deal at this school. So that's been around forever. And that's one of those arguments about this sense that things are out of control. Well, we've always had these problems. And at the same time, we are post Alston. This NIL really is a different game that's going on.
And more people keep joining the table, and obviously there will be people who have a bigger seat,
Right.
but it does make more things complicated in terms of how you're going to change this landscape. Yeah. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead. You go ahead.
Oh no, I was just gonna ask, like, for you, in your perspective, like through college athletics and kind of how you're seeing the landscape evolve. I guess it is so complicated with so many conferences, so many commissioners, so many schools who want to say, right? And I guess like you predicted, we'll have something where it's a conglomerate of like 40 to 80 schools, kind of being in the driver's seat. But how do other sports outside of football get affected from this? And is that like a big factor that you think should be considered? Like, I mean, I remember when USC, UCLA, Washington, Oregon joined the Big 10. It was like, well, I mean, there are kids who do track, who their rivalries are with, Arizona State. And so, do you think different sports should get different standards in the conference realignment, or do you think how big of an issue is that long term as well?
So I think the Big Ten expansion might be a good example. There'll be people who will disagree with me on this, but a good example of where presidents and ADs and commissioners might not be asking, is this in the best interest of students? Okay, we want to generate revenue, these things. But yes, Title IX will play a huge role in equity in terms of revenue, but also what that means for these different sports, especially for, women's athletics, which is really coming on strong now and also being monetized in many ways. Yes, all of that makes it a very, very complicated issue. You mentioned football, a fascinating story from the Jim Host book or memoir that I wrote with him. His not only did he work with different universities, including Texas A&M, with their radio networks in the 80s and 90s, but he worked very closely with the NCAA and March Madness and the basketball tournament and all that stuff. And he had pushed, Walter Byers was the president of the NCAA. He had pushed Walter Byers to do corporate sponsorships for the men's basketball tournament. Walter Byers refused, and then there was a big lawsuit, which you all may know about, when the College Football Association which is the big that's the big time schools had an association because they were upset that the little schools had so much power in the NCAA. One vote was one vote. Didn't matter if you were, and so the College Football Association sued the NCAA. They needed institutions to do it. So Oklahoma and Georgia sued the NCAA for their broadcast rights for football because long before you were born, but when I was a kid growing up, there would be one regional game on, then there would be a national game on. And then if you wanted to watch your team, it was going to be played on delay after the 10 or 11 o'clock news. And they said, we should be able to control this. Well, when that came down in the court, the Supreme Court ruled in favor of Georgia and Oklahoma, and in essence, all the big time schools. Walter Byers immediately went to Jim Host and said, tell me about this corporate sponsorship idea for the NCAA, because the NCAA was going to lose all its revenue. And so Jim Host was explaining, I'm not talking about signs for soft drinks in the arena. I'm talking about get Gillette to become the official razor of the NCAA men's basketball tournament and run commercials that say, win a trip to the Final Four with the back of your razor package. And he went and did this with pizzas and razors and cars and airlines and all of these things. And so outside of football, that's how that happens in basketball and creates all this revenue. But what a lot of people don't realize is the revenue for the men's and women's basketball tournament, but especially the men's tournament, that's what funds the NCAA, is that revenue. Without it, they can't do what they do. And so that's going to be a really interesting story as, there's talk of expansion, used to be 64. I still really think it kind of is 64 teams that, when you have to have your bracket done, that kind of thing, to more teams is going to be going to have impact, not just on basketball, but other sports as well.
1000%, Eric. And I think that's a really good, interesting point. Are there any other big misconceptions that you think a lot of people, or things that you might not, people like us fans or us like in this landscape, like might not know about the current collegiate landscape?
I think a lot of folks think that colleges spend ridiculous amounts of money for coaches. I don't think that they realize that coaches don't make ridiculous amounts of money from the universities, that make ridiculous amounts of money from whatever agency has their media rights. And so is Texas A&M a Learfield school? Do you all know?
Yeah,
okay,
we are.
So Learfield pays Texas A&M for their rights, and Learfield pays the coaches, right? And so sometimes we confuse this state employee kind of thing with, now it's a weird mix of, and I'm not arguing that the salaries are reasonable or that anything like that, but a lot of people think, why in the world would taxpayers be paying this? And in most cases, they're not. At the same time, there are lots of schools that have athletics fees that students pay to help make schools more competitive. And there is a lot of questions about, well, is that really wise for schools to do, right, especially the mid-majors who are trying to get into this upper echelon of schools and trying to do that. There are a lot of things that seem a little suspect in terms of who's paying for these kinds of things. But the financial examples of that, we could do a couple more podcasts about those kinds of things.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I was unaware of some schools actually incorporating fees for athletics in their tuition. That's
right.
So I guess we're going to kind of wind down the podcast now. I was just kind of wondering, what is your number one piece of advice for current students that are kind of perhaps interested in pursuing a career within academia, within research, or perhaps within college athletics?
I think it would be to follow your heart. Like I often toyed with the idea of getting involved in coaching, and I coached when I was a middle and high school teacher, and then decided, no, I don't think this is for me, but find your passion, right? And this is cliche, but if you find your passion, then it won't seem as much like work. It really is just doing what you love. And for me, that was in a higher ed setting, in an academic setting. For others, it may be, the grind of trying to get into coaching or trying to get into athletic administration and what that might be. And my other advice is be honest and ethical and transparent, even when you see people around you who are not being those things.
Yeah, certainly that last piece I feel like will resonate as policymakers kind of look to shaping the future of college athletics and all the new deals that are going around there.
Yeah. And Eric, I guess like as wrapping up like our closing thoughts on a little bit more of a personal side, who's your hero?
This won't help a whole lot because no one really knows him, but I'd say my dad. My dad passed away from COVID, but he's a good example of someone who changed jobs because he found himself making decent money, but not spending any time with his kids. And so he literally, when I was preschool aged, quit his job and switched to another job and took a massive pay cut so that he could coach my soccer teams and my little league teams and be a part of my life and the life of my siblings, and figured out what was important to him and did that. And for that, I feel very, very privileged. And there's a privilege that we talk about in higher ed that's a bad thing.
Yeah.
And there's a privilege that's a good thing that I hope everybody has, which is someone who's investing in them and someone who believes in them and someone who tells them to chase their dreams, but I'll be behind you no matter what. And he also loved athletics as well. So I'd say my dad, definitely.
No, yeah, we can definitely see that in just the way that you've interacted with us today. And I mean, how welcoming you've been throughout this whole process and us trying to get to interview you. So we really appreciate you, Eric, and you're living on his legacy 100%.
Well, thanks.
We if you want to give a shout out to your book or to a website or maybe to like one of the 10 universities that you've been to, please feel free to go ahead and
Sure. Well, yes, pick up a copy of College Sports: A History by myself and my academic mentor, John Thielen. And you can follow me on Facebook, Instagram. My daughters are working with me on improving my LinkedIn, but it's Eric Moyen. I need to do a better job with that, so I'm going to. So yeah.
Awesome thing. Eric, again, thank you so much. We really appreciate you, and we hope you have a wonderful rest of the semester. And thank you for joining us on the Why Not Sports podcast.
Thanks for having me, and same to you.